Imagine two men standing in the middle of a dense, unexplored wilderness in 1763. They aren't soldiers, they aren't explorers, and they certainly aren't looking for gold. They are scientists, one a quiet astronomer, the other a grumpy surveyor. Their only weapons are a massive brass telescope and a 66-foot-long iron chain. For the next 5 years, they will walk in a perfectly straight line, staring at the stars every night, just to settle a bloody family feud between two billionaire landlords who couldn't agree on where their property ended. Today, we know this as the Mason-Dixon Line, the ultimate cultural divide between the North and the South. But before it was a symbol of the Civil War, it was a masterpiece of boring mathematics and absolute obsession. This is the story of the most dangerous and most accurate geometry project in human history. To understand why this line exists, we have to look at the map of colonial America. In the 1600s, the British kings were giving away American land like it was candy. But there was a problem. The kings were in London, and they had no idea what the American geography actually looked like. In 1632, King Charles I gave the Calvert family, Maryland, a chunk of land. In 1681, King Charles II gave William Penn, Pennsylvania, another chunk. The problem, the descriptions in their legal documents overlapped. For nearly 80 years, the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania was a no-man's land. Farmers didn't know who to pay taxes to. Sheriff's deputies from both sides would have shootouts in the woods. People were being kidnapped and houses were being burned down, all because no one knew where a 40-mile strip of land belonged. By 1760, the Penns and the Calverts were tired of the legal bills. They needed the best surveyors in the world to draw a line that no one could argue with. They needed men who were obsessed with the boring truth. The job was so difficult that no American surveyor could do it. The line had to be perfectly straight for 233 miles, crossing mountains, swamps, and forests. If you were off by just 1 inch at the start, you'd be miles off by the end. In 1763, two men arrived in Philadelphia from London. One, Charles Mason, a brilliant, stoic astronomer from the Royal Observatory. He lived his life by the movement of the planets. The other, Jeremiah Dixon, a talented surveyor and a bit of a rebel. He was a Quaker who loved a good drink and wore a flashy red coat, something Quakers weren't supposed to do. They weren't friends, they were partners in a mission that would define their lives. This is where the boring history gets fascinating. Mason and Dixon didn't use GPS or lasers, they used the stars. They brought with them a zenith sector, a massive 6-foot-tall brass instrument that looked like something out of a steampunk movie. To find the exact latitude, Mason had to lie on his back on a wooden plank every night, staring through the telescope at specific stars as they passed directly overhead. Then they used Gunter's chain. Imagine a 66-foot chain made of 100 iron links. To measure the 233-mile line, they had to lay this chain down, level it, mark the spot, pick it up, and do it again. Over and over, thousands of times, through mud, snow, and rain. The line wasn't just on a map, it had to be visible. Mason and Dixon hired a crew of axemen. These men had one job, to cut a 24-foot-wide path through the ancient American forest. They called it the Visto. For 5 years, they carved a perfectly straight scar across the face of the continent. They cut down thousands of trees, moved massive boulders, and crossed freezing rivers. Every 5 miles, they placed a crown stone, a massive 1-ton stone pillar shipped all the way from England. On one side was the coat of arms of Lord Baltimore, Maryland, and on the other was the coat of arms of William Penn, Pennsylvania.
These stones were the physical anchors of the line, and many of them are still standing in the woods today, 260 years later. What makes this story incredible to an American audience is the accuracy. In the 1760s, Mason and Dixon were working with primitive tools. Yet when modern scientists checked their work with GPS and satellites in the 20th century, they found that Mason and Dixon were only off by a few feet. Their boring dedication to the stars was so precise that they were essentially doing space-age science in a wilderness full of wolves and hostile territory.
Drawing a line across a continent wasn't just a two-man job, it was a massive logistical nightmare. Mason and Dixon traveled with a crew of nearly 115 people. This included axemen, tent pitchers, cooks, wagon drivers, and even specialized guides. They weren't just surveyors, they were the leaders of a small, mobile village. Every morning, they had to pack up massive, delicate scientific instruments, brass telescopes and glass clocks that were sensitive to the slightest bump. They hauled these across mountains in heavy wagons pulled by oxen. If a single lens cracked, the entire project would stop for 6 months while a replacement was shipped from London. By 1766, the survey moved into the Appalachian Mountains. This was the edge of the known world. To the colonists, everything west was a dark, dangerous mystery. The land they were cutting through belonged to the Iroquois Confederacy and the Shawnee nations. The Mason-Dixon Line wasn't just a property boundary, it was a political landmine. The Native Americans watched these men cutting a 24-foot-wide scar through their hunting grounds and were rightfully suspicious. Why were these white men staring at the stars and measuring the dirt? To keep from being scalped or attacked, the survey had to hire Mohawk guides to negotiate their passage. These guides acted as diplomats, explaining to tribal leaders that this wasn't a military invasion, it was just two boring men obsessed with a line. This is why, for a brief window, the Mason-Dixon Line was known as the Line of Peace. How did they stay so straight? They didn't use a compass. In the 1760s, compasses were unreliable because of magnetic deviation caused by iron ore in the mountains. Instead, Mason and Dixon used celestial mechanics. Every night, Charles Mason would set up his zenith sector. He would wait for a specific star, like Alpha Lyrae, to cross the local meridian. By measuring the angle of the star from the zenith, the point directly above his head, he could calculate his exact latitude. But the Earth isn't a perfect sphere, it has mountains. Mason discovered that the gravitational pull of the Himalayan-sized peaks of the Alleghenies was actually pulling his pendulum slightly to the side. This is a phenomenon called deflection of the vertical. Mason was one of the first humans to realize that mountains have enough mass to mess up a clock. He had to account for the weight of the mountains just to draw a flat line. In 1767, the survey hit a wall. They reached Dunkard Creek, about 233 miles west of their starting point. Their Mohawk guide stopped and refused to go a single inch further. They told Mason and Dixon, "This is the limit of our treaty. Beyond this creek is the territory of the Delaware and Shawnee. If you cross, you die." Mason and Dixon were scientists, not martyrs. They didn't argue. They set their final marker, looked westward into the deep, dark forest they weren't allowed to touch, and turned back. They were only 31 miles short of the full distance they wanted to measure, but they had completed the most important part, the boundary that would define America. When the survey ended, the boring line of dirt and cut trees was replaced by the crown stones. These were carved in Portland, England, and carried by hand to the most remote parts of the wilderness. For the next 50 years, these stones sat silently in the woods. They were just property markers. But as the 1800s began, the boring line took on a dark, heavy meaning. Pennsylvania had abolished slavery, Maryland had not. Suddenly, that 24-foot-wide path through the woods became the difference between freedom and chains. A slave running through the dark woods didn't care about the Gunter's chain or the zenith sector. They cared about crossing that boring line to get to the north, the line that began as a way to settle a tax dispute between two rich families ended up being the border of a nation's soul. After the Mohawk guides turned them back at Dunkard Creek, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon returned to Philadelphia. They handed over their journals, their maps, and their calculations. They had spent 5 years in the mud and cold, mapping a line that was so boring most people in London didn't even care. But here is where the story turns into a scientific miracle. In the 1960s, exactly 200 years later, modern surveyors revisited the line using high-tech GPS, satellites, and laser ranging equipment. They expected to find massive errors. After all, Mason and Dixon were using heavy chains and staring at stars through clouds of mosquitoes. The results shocked the scientific community. They found that in many places, Mason and Dixon were accurate to within 1 inch per mile. In the 233-mile stretch, their total deviation was almost negligible. They hadn't just surveyed a line, they had performed one of the most accurate scientific experiments of the 18th century. While the line became a legend, the men who drew it did not. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon were not treated like heroes. The Penns and the Calverts, the billionaires who hired them, complained about the bill. The total cost of the survey was about £3,500, roughly $700,000 today, which the families thought was outrageous. Jeremiah Dixon returned to England and lived a quiet life. He never married and died at the age of 45, his body worn out by the years of physical labor in the American wilderness. Charles Mason's fate was even sadder. He tried to continue his career as an astronomer, but he was always overshadowed by others. Late in his life, he returned to Pennsylvania, the land he had measured so perfectly, hoping to find work. He died in Philadelphia just a few weeks after arriving, poor and almost forgotten. He was buried in an unmarked grave, only feet away from the very line he had spent his life defining. For the first 50 years, the Mason-Dixon Line was just a fence, but the boring survey was about to collide with a moral earthquake. In 1781, Pennsylvania passed the Gradual Abolition Act, making it a free state. Maryland, however, remained a slave state. Suddenly, that line in the dirt, the one Charles Mason spent nights lying on his back to calculate, became the most important border in the world. It was no longer about the Penns and the Calverts. It was about the Underground Railroad. If a runaway slave could put 1 foot over that boring line of stones, their legal status changed instantly. The stones, which were originally carved with coats of arms to represent wealth, became markers of liberty. This is why, even today, Americans refer to the Mason-Dixon Line as the divide between the North and the South. The line created a cultural split that still exists 260 years later. It influenced how people spoke, what they ate, and how they voted. If you live south of the line, you're in Dixie, a term many historians believe comes directly from Jeremiah Dixon's last name. The survey was so boring and so perfect that it created a permanent scar on the American map. It is the reason why the top of Maryland is flat and why Pennsylvania doesn't reach the Atlantic. It's a line made of math that turned into a line made of blood during the Civil War. If you drive through the woods of Pennsylvania or Maryland today, you can still find the stones. Many are covered in moss, some have been chipped away by souvenir hunters. But the Visto, that 24-foot wide path, is still there if you know where to look. Modern engineers still use Mason and Dixon's original markers as primary control points. The boring work done by 2 men with a chain and a telescope in 1763 is still the legal foundation for every property deed, every road, and every bridge in that region.
Charles Mason was a man of cold numbers, but his private journals tell a different story. For years, these journals were lost to history,
eventually found in a pile of waste paper in Halifax, Nova Scotia in the 1860s. They reveal the boring daily struggle that the official maps hide. Mason wrote about the great silence of the American wilderness. He described nights so cold that the ink in his pen froze, and he had to keep the ink pot near the fire just to write down the position of the stars. He wasn't just recording latitude, he was recording the isolation of a man who felt more at home with the constellations than with the people of the colonies. In one entry, Mason describes a moment of pure scientific frustration. He was trying to measure a specific line, but the wind was so strong it kept vibrating his 6-foot telescope. He had to build a temporary observatory, a small wooden hut with a slit in the roof, just to block the wind. To the local farmers watching from a distance, Mason looked like a wizard building a hut to talk to the sky. Before Mason and Dixon, land ownership in America was a mess of metes and bounds. A typical property deed would say, start at the large oak tree with the lightning scar, walk 200 paces to the pile of gray stones, then follow the creek to the fallen log. The problem? Trees die, stones get moved, and creeks change direction. This liquid geography led to thousands of lawsuits. Mason and Dixon introduced the concept of absolute geometry. Their survey taught Americans that land wasn't defined by what was on it, but by where it sat in relation to the stars and the equator. This boring shift in thinking is the reason why today you can buy a house in the middle of a flat field and know exactly where your yard ends to the millimeter. They turned the American landscape into a giant invisible grid, a system that later allowed the United States to map the entire West in perfect squares. One of the most difficult parts of the survey wasn't the long straight line, but the tangent line in Delaware. To settle the dispute, Mason and Dixon had to draw a line that touched the edge of a perfect 12-mile circle centered at the Newcastle courthouse. Imagine trying to walk in a line that is perfectly tangential to a circle that is 12 miles wide, using nothing but a chain and a telescope. It required a level of trigonometry that most mathematicians of the time couldn't even visualize. Mason and Dixon spent months in a tiny area of Delaware, moving their markers back and forth by fractions of an inch. To the locals, they looked like they were doing nothing, just standing in a field, staring at the ground. But they were solving a 12-mile-wide geometry puzzle that still stands as a miracle of surveying. While Mason and Dixon get the fame, we must talk about the axemen. These were the boring laborers who did the heavy lifting. They were mostly young men from the frontier who were paid a few shillings a day to swing heavy iron axes for 10 hours a day. They weren't just clearing a path, they were creating a Visto that had to be wide enough for the surveyors to see the stars near the horizon. They cut through ancient hardwoods, oaks and hickories that were 300 years old. They lived in tents, fought off rattlesnakes, and dealt with the ague, or malaria-like fevers. Without this army of laborers, Mason's math would have stayed in his head. The Mason-Dixon Line is as much a monument to the American axe as it is to the British telescope. Every project has a starting point. For Mason and Dixon, it was a point they called the postmarked P in a field in Philadelphia. They spent weeks just confirming the latitude of this one single post. They used a sector to track the star Gamma Draconis for nights on end. Why? Because if the starting point was wrong, the entire 233-mile line would be a disaster. This obsession with the starting point is the core of the boring history. It reminds us that in science and in life, the smallest error at the beginning leads to a massive failure at the end. Mason and Dixon's legacy is the sanctity of the start.
To understand the sheer boring brutality of this survey, we have to look at Gunter's chain. Jeremiah Dixon didn't just carry a measuring tape, he carried a 66-foot-long iron chain consisting of 100 links. But here is the problem with iron. It expands in the summer heat and contracts in the winter cold.
Mason and Dixon had to be human computers. Every few miles, they had to compare their chain against a standard brass rod kept at a constant temperature. If the chain had stretched by even 1/10 of an inch due to the heat, they had to redo the math for every single measurement they had taken that day. This wasn't just walking, it was constant, repetitive recalibration. To an observer, they were just two men fiddling with a chain in the mud, but in reality, they were fighting the laws of thermal expansion. Mason and Dixon weren't the first people to try and map this area. Local American surveyors had tried for decades, and they hated the two Englishmen. The local surveyors used basic compasses and estimation. They accused Mason and Dixon of being stargazing dreamers who were wasting time. The locals argued that a line should be drawn based on the magnetic north. Mason and Dixon argued that the magnetic north was a liar because it shifted every year. They insisted on using true north, calculated from the stars. This was a battle between convenience and truth. When the survey was finally proven to be perfect, it effectively fired every local surveyor in the colonies. It set a new, boring standard that made the old, lazy way of mapping obsolete. It was the first professional standards war in American history. Remember, Mason and Dixon were stopped 31 miles short of their goal at Dunkard Creek. For years, those last 31 miles were a ghost line. Because the math was so perfect up to that point, everyone assumed the rest of the line would just follow the same path. But without Mason and Dixon there to physically mark it, the 31-mile gap became a new zone of confusion. It wasn't until after the Revolutionary War, in 1784, that a new team, including Thomas Jefferson and the clockmaker David Rittenhouse, went back to finish those final miles. They used the exact same boring methods Mason and Dixon taught them. The fact that the founding fathers of the United States had to personally finish the line proves that Mason and Dixon hadn't just drawn a border, they had founded a school of American science. 30 miles west of Philadelphia, in a place called Embryville, there is a stone that is almost never visited by tourists. It's called the Stargazer's Stone. This wasn't a border marker, it was a scientific anchor. Mason and Dixon placed it there because it had a clear view of the horizon. They lived in a tent next to this stone for a whole winter. While the rest of the world was fighting wars or building cities, these two men spent 120 nights sitting next to a rock, staring at the sky and writing numbers in a book. This stone represents the boring patience required to build a nation. You can't have a country if you don't know exactly where your feet are standing. As we conclude this deep dive into the 100,000-word history, we have to realize that the Mason-Dixon line is more than a survey. It is a reminder that precision is power. The Calverts and the Penns wanted a line to protect their wealth. The Kings wanted a line to show their authority. But Mason and Dixon gave them something else, an absolute truth. In the history of America, many things have changed. Governments have fallen, wars have been fought, and the North versus South cultural meaning of the line has evolved. But the math has never changed. When you stand on a crown stone today, you are standing on the exact spot that Charles Mason calculated while lying on a wooden plank in 1765. In a world of lies and opinions, the Mason-Dixon line remains a boring monument to the fact that some things are objectively, mathematically true.
The Mason-Dixon line is a scar on the map, a border between cultures, and a masterpiece of astronomy. It started with a chain and ended with a divided nation. If you enjoyed this journey into the boring details that built the world, hit the subscribe button. And next time you're driving between Pennsylvania and Maryland, look for the Visto in the trees, because the math of 1763 is still watching you.